It's well known, even among casual Marvel fans, that in 2005's House of M event, Wanda Maximoff, aka the Scarlet Witch, declared no more mutants, using her reality-altering abilities to return Earth-616 from her Mutantopia alt-reality led by her father Magneto, but at the expense of nearly the entire mutant population. The Scarlet Witch's decimation and her decade-later retcon, so that Wanda was never in fact a mutant herself, has led to her label as the Great Pretender in the Jonathan Hickman creative era of X-Men. Yet, what if there's more to this story than meets the eye, and that Wanda's decimation is more thoroughly tied into the Krakoa era of X-Men and the schemes of Professor X, Moira MacTaggert, Magneto, and Mister Sinister than anyone would have known? And what if this secret history offers the road to redemption for the Scarlet Witch and huge ramifications for all of Marvel's mutants? Today I'll answer. What were Professor X and Moira's plans for Wanda? How did Mister Sinister manipulate the mutant status of Scarlet Witch? How does this all build to a modern X-Men Inferno 2.0? And theories and lots more reckless speculation for comics to come. Hey everybody, I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. You are listening to Crack and Krakoa. If you like the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel or Crack and Krakoa, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. You can find full X-Men and comic book reading orders on comicbookherald.com, of course with links in the show notes. And again, if you like the show, please like, subscribe, and comment here with theories of your own so I can hear them, respond, and discuss. Some spoilers for the history of Scarlet Witch may follow. Let's start with the retcon, okay? In 2015's Uncanny Avengers by Rick Remender and Daniel Acuna, it's revealed that Wanda Maximoff and her brother Pietro are technically not Marvel mutants and are actually just products of the High Evolutionaries experiments. One of my earliest Crack and Krakoa videos is entirely on whether this really holds up under scrutiny, okay? But regardless, this has been true in Marvel for 6+ years, and it remains true in the Hickman era, so we'll approach from that baseline. Now, something I'm going to talk about is if you read Marvel Comics from Uncanny X-Men number 4, Scarlet Witch's debut, in 1964 until that point of the retcon in 2015, it's clear Wanda was definitely a mutant, intended that way. There's all sorts of Marvel history that tells us she was in fact mutant. Sentinel readings and 70s stories, literally everyone's understanding of her, etc. She lived life as a mutant. In John Byrne's controversial Vision quest in the pages of West Coast Avengers, Wanda is more or less brainwashed to fully committing to Magneto's Silver Age visions for mutant conquest, and again, she undergoes tests here, in this comic from the late 1980s, 1989, I believe, where she is in fact, again, identified as a mutant, and someone who can then say, mutants such as us, Homo superior, her called us, she believes it, everyone around her believes it, test results seem to conclude, yes, Scarlet Witch is a mutant, okay? So jump ahead now. Heading into Avengers Disassembled in House of M, Wanda was a time bomb, right? Getting back into the mindset of post-Avengers Disassembled, Wanda Maximoff, daughter of Magneto, former evil mutant, longtime Avenger, has just brought Earth's mightiest heroes to one of their lowest points, including the deaths of the likes of Scott Lang, Vision, and Hawkeye, in a defeat so thorough the team disbands. After years of Agatha Harkness's memory spell helping Wanda forget her two twin sons were in fact a part of Mephisto's schemes, and never technically real, as per John Burns, this is why we can't have nice things, West Coast Avengers, Wanda wakes up, and all of reality becomes the plaything of her chaos magics. In the very final moments, Magneto and Professor X show up to take Wanda into their care, effectively her mutant family returning to give her, again, the care that she needs, okay? Magneto shows up, he shows remorse, says, I failed you. None of the Avengers seem to question that Magneto is taking Wanda away after the traumatic events of Avengers Disassembled, and this is kind of where we go heading into House of M. In Genosha, which is where Magneto and Professor X are, Professor X is the one who works with Wanda to try and prevent more disaster. And it's in Professor X's psychic therapy where things get really interesting. There's a couple options here in Professor X's treatment of Wanda on Genosha when considering the big picture of Hickman's X-Men. One, Moira could have experienced this before. I've talked about this before, but there are a number of moments in the mutant timeline that I look at and wonder if Moira had knowledge here, why did she let this thing happen? Genosha is one, right? The annihilation there by Cassandra Nova and Sentinels, and Decimation is certainly another. In some ways, it becomes a less theological, if there's a God, why do bad things happen kind of question. And if we're just being practical, ultimately Moira is one mutant. She simply can't be expected to change all major events throughout history. But truly, if Moira knows from any of her 10 lives that Wanda will decimate mutant kind, why let it happen? And the answer here might be that she knows the power of a scapegoat. She knows the power of a boogeyman. So part of her and Charles' scheme is effectively to let let these things happen, maybe even help make them happen so that mutant kind can ultimately flourish, right? This is a big picture endeavor that Moira and Professor X are on. They don't ultimately really mind if bad things have to happen in the short term if it means mutant survival into the distant, almost impossible to comprehend, distant future. So let's say Moira doesn't know though, and we take House of M as something that has only happened in Life 10. There's still a very real possibility that Professor X and Moira, and as I'll dig into it, likely Magneto and Mister Sinister, conspire to manipulate Scarlet Witch into the role of the Great Pretender. First off, look at the pages of House of X in the lead-in. Professor X's care is questionable at best and downright actively harmful at worst. Mostly he yells at Wanda and tells her to get rid of her kids. Okay? A real gentle touch here by Charlie. Is it possible that even here, Professor X is pushing to see if Wanda is a viable option for rewriting reality into a mutant haven, into using Scarlet Witch to turn the odds in their favor? I'm not ruling it out, and honestly, the more I think about it, the more I think you can make a strong case that Moira and Charles wanted House of M to happen regardless of impact, because as I'll explain, they already had an escape hatch planned if that didn't pan out. Whatever you make of Professor X's care, it's ultimately all for naught, as Wanda does turn the Marvel Universe into the House of M, and as we all know by now, in the event's final moments, famously declares no more mutants. Thus, decimation and all the, the complete or near complete eradication of mutant kind on Earth, leaving just the 198. Now let's step back and take a look at the optics here, okay? A mutant and former known mutant terrorist led to the deaths of various Avengers, disassembled the team, and is now responsible for the mutant gene removal of nearly 1 million mutants. Remember, this is no passive act either, as mutants died as a result of decimation, in addition to the emotional and psychological trauma that mutants are still unpacking through the likes of Krakoa's Crucible today. All of these terrible things are done by a mutant, and I suspect the Mutant Brain Trust could not let that be. So, when you need someone's DNA muddled with, there's really only one person for the job, Mister Sinister. Remember, we know Professor X and Magneto bring Sinister into their plans early in the timeline back in Powers of 10, and for what it's worth, much earlier than Moira MacTaggert would have liked. Truly, it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to imagine that Sinister is ultimately behind Wanda's sudden, no longer a mutant Marvel retcon, given that he has, given himself a mutant gene, and in theory could just as easily remove one from somebody. Or create a clone to remove one, or simply create the convincing appearance they are no longer mutants, right? There's a lot of options when we're talking about Sinister messing with genetics. I was struck, too, rereading the Chris Claremont issues of Excalibur, it's issues 11 and 12, that set the stage for House of M, that Claremont has actually already included Mister Sinister into the Scarlet Witch narrative. Claremont writes in that one of Sinister's many alter egos over time worked as an assistant to the High Evolutionary in Wundagore Mountain, Herbert Wyndham, okay? Which would give him ample opportunity to learn about, study, and ultimately compromise anything the High Evolutionary was working on, such as the High Evolutionary's role in the manufactured apparent mutant genes of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Again, back in that 2015 retcon, it's the High Evolutionary who is ultimately behind and the one who tells them, you are not mutants, that is not real. It's absolutely a part of established Marvel continuity that Sinister was deeply integrated into these endeavors and would have had every opportunity to influence them. Not to mention that these same issues establish more of a connection to Sinister masquerading as an Oxford connection of Moira MacTaggert's in secret, deepening the character's presence and influence over the course of mutant history. Sinister is everywhere with these characters, whether you realize it or not. He is so deeply integrated into their lives, it's actually very, very hard to shake the feeling that he's in control of nearly everything that is happening with the X-Men. It's one of the thrilling aspects and also one of the dangers with this character, who, again, as I've said time and time again, is a walking retcon machine. Okay, and voila, just like that, now you have your Great Pretender and your Boogeyman, with Sinister working to mask or remove Wanda and Pietro's mutant birthright whenever it's convenient for the Krakoan plot to set into motion, right? This is a trigger he can pull at any time through this planning and through this scheming that was set into motion way back when. But again, I would question whether this is a permanent state of affairs or simply a deception via Sinister, who is of course known as an immensely skilled deceiver, right? Lies are built upon lies when we're talking about the character of Mister Sinister and what he may have done, removing or changing or altering or simply altering the perception of Wanda and Pietro's status as mutants. When I was returning to the original 1989 X-Men Inferno, I sort of wondered aloud what a 2.0 rendition might look like in the Hickman era of X-Men, and what elements would make it work, right? In the original, Madeline Pryor's descent into the Goblin Queen is predicated on the revelation that she's a clone of Jean Grey via Sinister, and the compounding trauma of suddenly questioning her realness, okay? And the reason I'm considering, like, why even bother thinking, like, maybe we're heading towards an Inferno is, of course, because in Powers of 10, in those Sinister secrets, there's that call out that, like, hey, pay special attention if any characters mention the word Inferno. It just sets up the feeling that, like, there could be a sequel, there could be an Inferno 2.0 event that all this is building to. So for an Inferno 2.0 in the Krakoa era of X-Men, I think a return to the same well of Madeline Pryor would be a mistake. Not to mention that we kind of already saw similar themes and ideas and kind of a sequel of sorts to the story play out in the pages of Hellions, right? That story kind of exists within Hellions. I'm not sure doing it as a separate event necessarily makes a whole lot of sense. To me, the better version is Wanda Maximoff in the Madeline Pryor role, and let's not forget about Pietro and all of this, uncovering that maybe Pietro can be like the Havoc, wearing those, super skimpy, torn-up outfits, right? Uncovering the revelation of Mister Sinister's influence in Wanda's life, and the absolute heartbreak and rage that would follow, okay? So we say everything that has happened here, all of this, you finding out you're not even a mutant, you enacting House of M and the No More Mutants line, maybe you were pushed into and controlled and altered in so many ways by Mister Sinister, okay? The absolute hardest nut to crack here for me is how you tackle this in such a way that Inferno 2.0 is not yet another Wanda enters shaky mental stability territory and goes on a rampage, which, as we've seen, is a well that's been visited far too often, right? Whether we're talking Burns West Coast, whether we're talking Disassembled, House of M, even something like an Avengers Children Crusade, which tries to sort of say, like, actually, it was Doctor Doom the whole time. None of those, like that, like the attempts to sort of absolve Wanda of blame, they really haven't stuck, which is why I think you need something more thoroughly integrated into the character's history, a la Sinister. I do think a possible route around, quote-unquote Dark Wanda here too, is looking at one, Wanda reclaiming and owning her mutant heritage, okay, and what that means for her. Like, what are the positive sides of this, of her becoming a mutant again, and sort of realizing, like, this is who I am, this is who I really am, and this is who I was meant to be. And then two, the impact of mutant kind finding out that Wanda was set up as the Great Pretender by their own. Remember, Wanda is hated among mutants, and mutants like Wolverine has straight up recommended murdering her for her role in mutant decimation. And not only, like, not just once, right? If it were revealed that Sinister, Professor, and Moira had a hand in causing what happened with Decimation, an Inferno on Krakoa would certainly be well within possibility. It could be a fracturing event, a civil war of sorts amongst Krakoan kind. You could see, like, the likes of Beast, for example, being like, oh, cool plan, Professor, really dig it, works out, totally my cup of tea. But then obviously many, many mutants would absolutely lash out at what was done there, and essentially the ways that all of them in many ways were manipulated. Ultimately, this path knocks out two birds, one stone. You reset Wanda's modern character-defining guilt, at least to some degree, and you reset her status as a mutant in the Marvel Comics universe the way 99% of fans and creators intended, right? Like, I think so many Marvel fans right now are looking at this and saying, listen, we know the exterior factors that pushed that 2015 retcon, right? It was so much to do with movie rights, Marvel movie rights, and saying, well, we don't have the rights to the mutants and the X-Men at this point in time, so Wanda and Pietro, you can't be mutants in the comics. It's kind of a petty thing in the comics landscape. Get out of that. There's no reason to keep that. It's a second chance for Wanda. It's a chance to make her a mutant again, and it's a massive revelation for all of Krakoa that could lead to an extremely, extremely exciting and exhilarating storyline that I would love to see a Hickman Inferno 2.0. This is a creator who revisited the well of Secret Wars 2015. And whether it's mostly for branding purposes or not, like, it works. Thematically, it connects to Secret Wars of past, the 84-85 series, and it's also fantastic. It is my favorite Marvel event of all time. I think Inferno 2.0 has that potential. I just think ultimately, like, you integrate the Scarlet Witch into this. It's one of the most interesting characters in the Marvel Universe. I think there's really clever ways that it's been roadmapped and you could tie in the past, especially with that Claremont Sinister stuff from Excalibur that is just like begging to be played with, and I think it's just sitting right there. I think this is what is a very strong possibility for an Inferno 2.0, and what X-Men and what Hickman and the whole X office wind up doing with the character of the Scarlet Witch and returning her to her mutant status, which allows for, I think, more interesting stories in the future for her, for Quicksilver, and frankly for all of mutant kind. So there you have it. That is my Sinister Scarlet theory. I'm definitely curious. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear how you think this might work, what you would add to it, how you would build on it, different ideas you have for Scarlet Witch in the X-Men, or just Inferno 2.0, or anything I covered here. Definitely let me know in the comments as well. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks in particular to those of you over on patreon.com/comicbookherald who are supporting the site financially. It helps me out a great deal. In particular, I want to thank everybody in the mysterious benefactors tier on Patreon. We have Verisimilitude, Terranort, Ed Mackey, Clyde DeGlide, Pinball Drew, Mike Solomons, Matt Mahoney, Jesse W., Professor Pride, Cole Weathers, Martin Lopez, Chris Isidro, Brent Bowser, Professor X3769, and PD Appleseed. Hey guys, I'm Dave. You can find my stuff at comicbookherald.com, at comicbookherald, pretty much anywhere on social. Look for the best comics ever and my Marvelous Year podcast for more from me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go crack out some other harebrained theories about Marvel Comics and probably think about WandaVision some more. Thanks everybody for listening, and as always, enjoy the comics.